Hi, I'm Don Cantor, former co-director of JLIC at Johns Hopkins University and current director at the Richmond Jewish Learning Experience in Richmond, Virginia.
And I'm Alex Ozar, co-director of JLIC at Yale University, and this is the Torah JLIC podcast. JLIC supports thousands of young Jews in their college years and beyond, providing them with the nourishment they need to sustain an upward trajectory of Jewish commitment and growth as they enter the broader world. And the animating engine of that effort, that has always been and will always be Talmud Torah, high-level, richly meaningful, thoughtfully creative Torah learning, ambitiously attuned to the realities of where our students are. On the Torah JLIC podcast, we hope to share some of that Torah with you. Thanks for listening.
Today, Rav Alex has the privilege of talking to Rav Moshe Moskowitz. For me, it is mixed, for I am forced to confront the reality that no man ever wants to have to admit, that he is replaceable. As you hear at the open of each of our episodes, I am the former co-director of JLIC at Johns Hopkins University. Rav Moshe Moskowitz is my replacement, the current director. Rav Moshe grew up in New York and Montreal prior to attending the New England Rabbinical College in Providence, Rhode Island, where he earned a degree in rabbinics. He spent 2 years in Jerusalem, where he learned under Rabbi Moshe Wolpin, and subsequently taught at a yeshiva for American teens at risk before returning to Providence, where he spent 10 years working with students on campus at Brown University. Rav Moshe is a barbecue enthusiast, coffee addict, and Pachad Yitzchak fanatic. In 2014, Ford magazine recognized Rav Moshe as one of America's most inspiring rabbis. Rav Moshe, I asked this question to Rav Alex a couple episodes ago. I'm going to ask you, what is with you and Pachad Yitzchak?
Oh, man. I'll be honest, I'm probably on my second set of interactions with Pachad Yitzchak. I've always had an affinity for, lack of a better phrase, the Torah of Hashkafa, the underlying why of Yiddishkeit. And the Pachad Yitzchak is definitely a part of that canon. But for whatever reason, when I began to learn that Torah at a younger age, I found it a little bit inaccessible, almost like a closed book. And a couple of years ago, I don't know what inspired me to start over. And I realized that the Pachad Yitzchak does an incredible job of taking many of the parts of Yiddishkeit or of Torah that seem not just simple, but simplistic, and revealing that there's actually a toothsome, satisfying, deep, underlying reason to those concepts or ideas. And as somebody that's always on the hunt for that sense of deeper meaning, the Pachad Yitzchak has become, dare I say, a best friend.
That was a great answer. Way better than mine.
Do you find yourself sharing Pachad Yitzchak often with your students?
It's a work in progress. I think the first couple of years on a new campus, a big chunk of the work that's necessary, maybe the hardest part of the job, is getting a sense of who the students are, what the vibe at the school is, what their experience as students at that school is like, and what's the Torah that's going to be meaningful or relevant to them. Like you had mentioned, I spent more than a decade at my last campus, and over time, felt like I had at least a working picture of what the student experience was like. And again, you can never generalize. All of our students are individuals with unique facets to their personality, but there's a vibe to the school, and you learn to speak to them. You learn what's on most of their minds, and you find the sources of Torah that are most meaningful or most accessible or most relevant or most earth-shattering or just the most that speak to them. And a year and a half, let's say, into my time at Hopkins, and I'm still learning the vibe. Pachad Yitzchak is definitely a part of the arsenal. It remains to be seen what percentage of the arsenal that I need a better sentence than that. It's a terrible expression.
Moshe, tell us how you got involved in campus work and what that meant to you 10 years ago, what it means to you now.
If you want to do the full-on deep dive.
We absolutely do.
We have to, okay.
But like in a few minutes.
Sure. Maybe I'll get a tiny bit meta about it and share a one-line Torah thought that might help explain the meta idea over here. I remember hearing from Rabbi Gershenfeld, former boss and one of the great teachers of Torah today, about how the Torah has many different words for conveying information, like Vayomer and Vayedaber, And many of us might be familiar with the tone that each of those expressions sets for us. And then there's language of storytelling. And when the Torah is teaching us halachas, then it's always amira or dibur. Sometimes it's nitty-gritty details. Sometimes it's broad concepts. Sometimes it's the imperative and it's a command, or it's something a little harsh. And sometimes it's soft-spoken, but it's conveying information. But when the Torah needs to speak to your heart, so then there are two expressions that show up consistently, Haggadah and Sipur, both expressions of storytelling. And the difference between those two expressions is that Haggadah is the deep dive. It's showing that in a single moment there are layers and layers and layers to the experience or the story or what's happening in that moment. Whereas Sipur is the idea of an epic. It's showing that this story started a long time ago and will continue for a long time, in understanding your positioning in the storyline, in the arc. And that was a really eye-opening short tidbit of Torah that was shared with me. And so to answer your question, I think we need a little bit of Sipur and Haggadah. And the nutshell version is there are a handful of pieces of Torah that I remember being astonished, not just by the beauty or the meaningfulness of that particular piece of Torah, but because I felt like I finally was touching a little bit of that underlying truth. There was something really satisfying about it. It was something that I may have been taught, or may have more accurately understood at a shallow level. And then a Rebbe came along and shared this piece of Torah. I'm like, oh no, that's actually what we're talking about over here. This is the level of understanding or significance that I've been hunting for. And at a certain point, I realized that because that experience was so meaningful for me, the ability to share that with other people was equally satisfying and enriching. And I don't know if I knew at the time that that's what I wanted to do as a career. I actually sort of flirted with a number of different professions, but I think that was the underlying reason of why I went into this work. In terms of actually starting on campus, it was a happy accident. I was part-time working on a degree, doing a little bit of hashgacha work. Shout out to all the hardworking mashgichim and mashgichot out there, because it is miserable. You work weekends, you're underappreciated. So I will appreciate the work that you do, even if I hope to never go back to that career. And then there was somebody I'd met, moved to town doing Jewish outreach on campus at Brown. Noticed that I had good rapport with the students when I would come over to his house for Shabbos meals, and asked if I wanted to be his assistant. I was coming up on almost 15 years ago. I started out as his assistant at Brown. He left and I took over the program for 6 years. I worked directly for the Brown RISD Hillel for another 6 years. And then a year and a half ago started on campus at Johns Hopkins.
Has your view or experience of work changed over the years?
Rav Wolbe would say that Jewish outreach requires das, not just knowledge of a lot of Torah, but the ability to make hard decisions. Like when you have students that are growing not all at once, but in small steps, how are you going to triage between whether kashrus or Shabbos is the next move that they should be taking on, knowing it's only going to be one of them? And those are hard questions to deal with in terms of Jewish outreach. And I would say that in the JLIC world, it's similar. It takes time to learn to meet students where they're at. It takes time to understand that your picture of their success, much like parenting, is a good starting point, but it's probably not actually what their success is going to look like or should look like. And so while maybe I was a little bit more idealistic at the beginning and had big ideas or big plans about creating, revolutions in the Jewish world on campus, I think I'm better at my job as time has gone on, because I've learned some of that patience, and I would say fairly consistently working to be able to appreciate students as they are.
Do you think that kind of triage that you mentioned is different with the students that you work with than it is for you or anyone else that you know?
It's a great question. I think I would assume almost everybody goes through the experience of, to some extent, being understanding of their own challenges because you're in it. And so you know that you're not doing everything perfect. And there's a genuine struggle to not let that define you. But you also can be accepting of your weaknesses or your missteps because you know, hopefully, that you're on a path of growth. When you're dealing with somebody else, so then you see a little bit more clearly. You're less nogeh b'davar, you have less personal bias. But it also can be easier to be judgmental or rigid. And so for some of us, we're only going to experience that in our limited circle of interpersonal relationships, how we deal with our spouse or our children. For those of us that are teaching or leading communities, it's just more of a part of our day.
Do you have some Torah that you'd like to share with us today?
I guess I was unintentionally foreshadowing when I mentioned that I've been on the hunt for the Torah that's meaningful or that speaks to your heart. And especially in the last year and a half, I found that it wasn't one specific piece of Torah that got me through that time, but it's been a series of little tidbits of Torah. So this little sentence hopefully will be edited out. Thank you in advance, Don, for all the hard work that I'm leaving. Although now it's for sure going to be left in.
Because it has the thank you at the end.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I think there have been two types of Torah that have been helpful and meaningful over the last little while. Some of those are tidbits of Torah that speak to the moment that we're going through. It's kind of hard to imagine, and I'll try and say this graciously without being judgmental and maybe look a little bit inwards instead of outwards. We're going to have a hard time explaining what we went through to our grandchildren one day. Like when you put it on paper, the last 5 years is the stuff that makes it to the history books. Like a world absolutely turned upside down in at least two major ways, between a global pandemic and living in a post-October 7th world. There's this pressure that comes with it. These are the types of times that when you heard stories about this as a child, it was like, and then they doubled down and they grew the flax and slaughtered the deer and taught Torah to 5 people. And that's how the world exists today. If you want to get Talmudic about it, or like, and then they spit in the face of the Nazis and escaped and survived, or like, and that's how I went from giving up my multi-million-dollar career in a terrible business to becoming an observant Jew, or whatever the life-changing sort of shift is. And we're just desperately holding on to survive. I mean, there are some people out there that are doing amazing things. God bless them. But some of us are feeling the pressure. And one part of me worries, like, how is it that I personally and the Jewish world that I'm a part of has changed so little? Like, really, we've just done a little bit more of what we were doing until we got exhausted, and that was it. I've been looking for the Torah that speaks to that. Either the Torah that helps you find those moments of inspiration, or at least tell me I'm not alone in feeling this way. The Piasetzner Rebbe, interestingly, in 2 of his Sfarim, has been the balance between those 2 ideas for me personally. If you're looking for the Torah of suffering, for the Torah to get you through difficult times, for the Torah that motivates you to respond to the upheaval in the world by becoming more, and the Torah that acknowledges that that's really difficult and sometimes you can't get it together that way. So Eish Kodesh, written in the Warsaw Ghetto, is the Torah for that. And if you're looking for broad, majestic, deep ideas about how Torah should speak to you, about how to have authenticity in your relationship with Hashem, so then his pre-war Torah, the Derech haMelech, while much more difficult and a little less accessible, but every so often I've found like a paragraph that just speaks to me. And then I had this awesome experience where I found a paragraph that speaks to me about the experience of learning a lot of Torah, but only finding one paragraph that speaks to you. And so I found that maybe that's where I would start from, just to share two brief ideas. One is an Eish Kodesh on Behaloscha, and maybe it's influenced by some other Torah of his. But he asked the following fascinating question in Musaf on the Shalosh Regalim, or really any time where we have Birkat Kohanim. So we have a little paragraph before Modim of Visei Arev, and there's an expression in there that troubles him. We ask Hashem that he should find our tefillah as sweet and pleasing as if we were bringing sacrifices. And then we, acknowledging that we can't bring sacrifices, ask Hashem to be merciful and to return the Shechina, his presence, to Tzion, and return the structure, the Seder Avoda, back to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash. And then in that post-Messianic moment, you've brought back the Shechina. We now have a Beis HaMikdash. We're bringing karbanos. So we say, V'sham na'avadcha b'yira, ki me'olam uchashanim kadmonios. And there we will serve you with yira, with fear, with awe. And the Piasetzner is puzzled. Serving Hashem with awe, or with fear especially, is so much easier in Galus, in exile, when your life hangs in the balance, when there's upheaval and uncertainty, when you have that tangible sense of fear, that tangible sense of being uncertain about your future, and then you can maybe channel that towards serving Hashem. But why is it that the ultimate expression of serving Hashem with Yira is only going to be once Mashiach is here, once we have a rebuilt Beis HaMikdash? And he says the following, Aval af sheyira yeshna lanu ata merov oni v'tzar. It's true we have an abundance of fear because we're suffering. Mikol makom lavad Hashem b'yira kasha lanu. But to serve Hashem with that fear, with that intensity, it's very difficult. Pashat mipnei she'ein manichim lanu. On a simple level, because sometimes external forces won't allow us. But even when that's not the case, v'gam mipnei shviras halev v'nefilas kol ruchenu. Even if it's just because you're feeling a little broken inside, or because you're feeling low, or you're feeling that sense of pressure. So you're going through this intense experience, but it's so intense that you almost shut down. And he acknowledges that. Sometimes you're in a moment that a part of you wants to say, like, rise to the occasion, and you can't. You just feel squished by it. So he says that in the aftermath, the arrival of Mashiach, so then, like, those experiences that we went through now are something that we'll be able to access in our service of Hashem then. It was such an interesting idea to me to think about that it is valid that you can be going through a difficult time, and the appropriate response is not always, it's not, how are you going to flip this into becoming a better, more intense, more devout servant of Hashem in this moment? Sometimes what you need to be doing is, how do I make it through this and just hold on to my experience? And later, at some moment where I have breathing room, then I can look back on it and turn it into something more.
Did you share this with your students?
I did. I shared it with the students because Hopkins is a smaller campus. And being that Hopkins is a smaller campus, sometimes there are opportunities that other larger campuses have the bandwidth to respond to. But in a small campus where everyone is at capacity, you don't. And it can feel, you can feel the sense of pressure, or the sense of, I don't know if anyone would say this out loud, of being less than. Like, how is it that post-October 7th, we haven't doubled everything that we're doing? And the answer is because everyone is doing as much as they can already. And so that's not what your growth is going to look like. And so it's really inspiring to see campuses that have large groups of students. Now, many of those students are mobilized to do more. And we were struggling to do better, but couldn't necessarily do more, or couldn't do that much more. So to see a piece of Torah from a well-respected source that says, sometimes when you're suffering, even though it's true that theoretically You could transform that moment immediately into a moment of growth, but not always. Sometimes you have to understand that what you're going through is too much for you in that moment to rise above it. And instead, you have to be with it. And you have to internalize what you're going through and make it to the other side. And then when you've held on to that difficulty, when you realize, like, I've made it through a year on campus that was incredibly difficult, and I'm here on the other side still whole. What did you do with it? I held it and I survived. It's not for nothing. Like, Visham Navadcha B'yira. At some point, you'll take that yira and turn it into what it's meant to transform into. But it's not always that storybook ending of you're in this intense moment of difficulty or challenge or nisayon, and right now you need to be more. It's right now you need to be with it. Right now you need to hold on to this. Right now the growth is happening inside, somewhere you can't see, and it'll express itself later. That to me was really meaningful and relevant Torah, to see that there's more than one picture of victory or success in a moment of nisayon or hardship or struggle.
It seems like continuing on and doing the same things that you were doing, that in a completely different circumstance, as long as it's not something that you're doing while you're ignoring the circumstance, it becomes something qualitatively different, even if it might look the same.
It is, but it can be hard to tell that to yourself when you compare yourself to what you see other people doing. It's not a great, 30-second Instagram reel. Here I am doing what I did yesterday. Aren't you inspired? Like, it doesn't make great content. So it's nice to have somebody telling you it's not always about those type of moments. Like, maybe it's always going to boil down to that truism of the Ramchal, that a huge percentage of your growth as a Jew is hammering home and deepening your understanding of things that you already know to be true, not necessarily those moments of chiddush, but those moments of deepening. It's interesting. Maybe we're on a little bit of a theme over here. One of the other pieces of Torah that spoke to me during this time was a pre-war tidbit of Torah from the Piasetzner Rebbe. The way he prefaces it is, sometimes you have a difficult time connecting to ideas because you feel like it's coming from outside of you. You feel like I'm me, and something else is speaking to me or impacting me or trying to influence me. But you can sense the division or the tension between there's me, and then there's this other advice, this other voice. Like, when somebody speaks to you, I think in my voice, my own internal monologue. And then you might hit me with the most beautiful Torah, but I'm hearing it in your voice. And there can be tension between those two things. But he quotes a medrash that says, Moshe Yadaber v'Halokim ya'anenu b'kol. Moshe would speak and Hashem would respond. And the medrash says Hashem would respond b'kolo shel Moshe. Moshe heard Hashem speaking in Moshe's own voice. And that one aspect of a prophetic experience of Nevuah is that you no longer hear Hashem as something outside of you or something different, or here's me and here's something that's trying to change me, and that can be awkward or uncomfortable or a source of tension. You hear Hashem speaking to you in your own voice. And then he goes on to challenge you to find the times where your own internal thoughts are actually moments where Hashem is speaking to you. And so obviously this is one of those dangerous Hasidic ideas that if you take super literally or just slap it onto any generic, trust your instincts, whatever you decide is right, it can be a dangerous piece of Torah. But this idea of recognizing that sometimes the way that Hashem speaks to you most directly are the thoughts that are already going through your own head. He explains that's why how Yosef interprets Paro's dreams and why everyone assumed that the two dreams were two different stories. And he says, like, because Hashem was speaking to Paro through his own thoughts, Yosef had to figure out what's the message from Hashem and what's the sort of overlay Paro's own internal thoughts. And so Yosef says, like, oh, you're worried about grain and you're worried about sustenance. So one time it's cows and one time it's grain, but the message is the same. Like, that is the Paro element over here. This might have been a little too far afield. The point is that it was so interesting to see this idea of Hashem. He uses it more directly. It was so interesting to see this idea that sometimes the simple thoughts that you have in your head, the internal monologue that you experience, is Hashem speaking to you. The example that he uses of that is the moments where you feel down or doubt yourself or feel like you are lacking. When you recognize that you're feeling a little bit distant from Hashem, in that moment, Hashem is calling out to you. I know I'm new to the world of modern Orthodox Torah, and so I've been dabbling. Although, to be honest, consistently I've been drawn to intricate, beautiful, deep Torah, regardless of what type of kippah the author wore or which community they were from. My grandfather, who was as haMelech Haredi could get, he learned in Chachmei Lublin back in the day before the war. So he had a small shul in the Bronx and later in Flushing, Queens, and then in Borough Park. And after he passed, I inherited a lot of his Sfarim. And I noticed that on his shelves, he had the Satmar Rebbe's Ala Geula Vala Tmura next to his almost complete collection of the works of Rav Soloveitchik, which I think maybe says a little bit about my own relationship with Torah, but I inherited his Ala Tshuva. Anyways, I remember Rav Soloveitchik says that that's the Hashem, that in those moments after you've done something wrong, Hashem also reaches, who gives you those feelings of like, maybe this was a mistake, maybe I'm lacking, maybe there's something that's missing over here. And he talks about how challenging those moments can be. And he has this fascinating idea of, on the pasuk of, Achazo HaKadosh Baruch Hu liyiravam bevigdo, v'amar lo chazar bach. Chazal say bigdo is not his cloak, but boged, his rebellion. In that moment of rebellion, Hashem can speak to you. And in that challenging moment, he says that your task is to say, Achazdev v'lo arpenu. I see Hashem in this difficult moment, and I at least won't turn away from it. This idea of learning that hidden within your own thoughts and your own experiences, if you become sensitive to it, you can find the times where Hashem is speaking to you directly, was a pretty powerful piece of Torah. He has another piece on Shemos, and maybe this one's a little bit more practical. This is a great little tidbit from one of the early Hasidic masters. I want to say it's the Kashnitzer Magid, where the Mishnah in Avos says, Da mala mimcha, ayin roa, va'ozen shomas, v'chom asacha b'sefer nechtavim. Know what is above you, meaning stay away from Avera, because the following three things are true. There's an eye that sees everything, there's an ear that hears everything that's spoken, and everything you do is recorded in a sefer, which essentially is the reality we live in. This Mishnah probably took quite a bit of emunah prior to our current technological state of existence, but now it is true. Someone is looking at me, and ears are listening. The Kashnitzer Magid said, Da mala mimcha, if you want an answer from Hashem. So there were three different eras of this. The first was ayin roa. You could ask the Urim V'Tumim, and the stones would light up, and you could see your answer. And then once the Urim V'Tumim were lost, ozen shomas, at least you had a bas kol that could occasionally give you a tidbit from heaven, like, oh, this is the direction you're meant to go in. And once we've lost bas kol, v'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nechtavim. If you're looking for answers from Hashem, you'll find it in Sfarim. And so the Pias Etzner talks about this idea. V'kol ish yodea u'margish zos. Every person has had this experience. Shelafa'amim k'shemar b'listakel b'sefer. Sometimes you've spent quite a bit of time looking at a particular book. Pitom, mispal me'ez davar v'nirta le'achorov. Out of nowhere, something hits you, and it turns you around. V'adavar zen noke v'holech b'libo. It drills its way into your heart. Lo yenuach v'lo yishkot kama shanim. You won't sleep at night for years because this one line, this one sentence is echoing in your brain. It's vibrating in your heart. This one line can turn you into a totally different person. To elevate you, to make you holy. How could this be? You have years of Rebbeim, Moras, teachers, rabbis and rabbanites that have pointed out everything that you've done wrong. And you've learned all of the musar about this particular thing. It had no impact. Now, out of nowhere, this thing is poking a hole in your heart. It's echoing in your brain. This is a modern expression of the Urim V'Tumim. Kala osios ksuvim, all the letters were carved on these stones. And only some of the letters lit up and sparked in the eyes of the Kohen. But like the Rambam says, Avarakla Kohen Bal Ruach HaKodesh, only a Kohen that had Ruach HaKodesh could read the Urim V'Tumim, could get that experience of certain letters lighting up. I think why this spoke to me is it was an example of a piece of Torah that I think describes a universal experience. And there's something so satisfying about seeing it explained so thoroughly that every person has had this moment. There's the apathy, there's the mitzvahs anashim milumada, which I love because every time I've heard that expression quoted, they just quote it. No one tells you where it's from, who said it, or what it actually means. It's like this tiny little meta experience of mitzvahs anashim milumada that a person can do mitzvahs out of habit, right? That the mitzvahs of a person are milumadim. They're just like what you've been trained to do. It's one of those things that I probably heard 100 times in a Musar Shmooze and never actually bothered to look up. And now I think it's humorous, so I probably won't look it up. But that idea of seeing like everyone's had that, like, why is this getting to me? He describes like you can get an aliyah and it doesn't mean anything. And then sometimes there's one sentence in the Torah that's being read and you're like, holy smokes, this is some sort of heebie-jeebie experience where Hashem is talking to me via Sefer Torah. So I would say maybe what defines the Torah of each individual moment is this combination, like the Torah that's going to give you the strength, that's going to give you advice or guidance on how to approach the situations that you're going through, and the Torah that can highlight those shared universal experiences. I don't know, I've always, for one reason or another, been on the hunt for those. Like, what are those examples that 95% of the people in the room, if you use that as your example in a shiur or a class, like everyone's going to be nodding. Sometimes if you don't have that, your whole shiur can be off the mark because you try to bring everyone in. See, doesn't everyone know this feeling? And they look at you like you are, what's the word I'm looking for? Old and obsolete. And sometimes your mashal nails it. And the Torah that's like that, I'm a collector of. I don't know, maybe the perfect example.
I think you found the right mashal for the people in this room.
Okay. I remember like one time when I used a mashal of the experience of Gehenna as like when you wake up the day of a final knowing that you haven't studied and there's nothing that you can do to fix it and it's all your own fault and you can't blame anybody and there are about to be real consequences. And then like there's that moment of terror. And then it goes away because you tell yourself like, oh, it's going to be fine. I'll be all right. Even though there's no evidence that it's going to be fine or that you're going to be all right. And Gehenna is that first experience without the opportunity to do the second. But anyways, I'm a little off topic over here. But I know that first description of showing up to school and you are unprepared and it's all your fault, like everyone in the room was nodding, which is terrible. But also like a good example of that type of mashal.
Moshe, have you gotten good reactions from your students to these kinds of ideas? Have you seen transformations, reorientations, allowed them to do things or focus on things they hadn't been able to do before? I think there's so much potential here.
So let's answer the question sensitively, because I have I don't know what the right word for this is. Challenge is almost too optimistic of filling some big shoes. And not just,
what is your shoe size, dude?
Right. I don't even mean that facetiously.
I wear big shoes, but they're too big for me. I just wear really big shoes.
Yeah, right.
I think Rav Dan did an amazing job of having a clear perspective that was broadcast to the students, an approach. And sometimes I feel I'm a little bit more scattered and moving from tidbit to tidbit, but there isn't a universal theory of Moskowitz yet. And so some students have been reacting really well to this. Some of them have been converted to follow the Vilna Gaon and only the Vilna Gaon, and nothing I say is going to change that, is not the real answer to the question. For some students, it's been really meaningful. I think it also takes a certain amount of, maybe vulnerability is the right word, to be open to Torah like this. And that takes time in a relationship. You can't just show up on a campus and expect that everyone's going to jump into soul-searching or life-changing Torah together. A first date's a first date, and a third date's a third date. Like, you've got to, you know what conversation you bring at the beginning of your time on campus, and then slowly deepen it. Like, I think this is so obvious it almost shouldn't be said. But there's a Venn diagram sweet spot for our work on campus. And it has to be where there's overlay between the Torah that you're passionate about and that motivates you, and that resonates with your students. And you're not always going to be in that sweet spot. Sometimes your daily Dvar Halacha is going to be a daily Dvar Halacha. And that's it. I feel bad. There are tremendous teachers of Torah out there that everything that they say like hits the mark. And if one of them would ever interview for the position at Johns Hopkins, I'd be out of a job, because I am not that. But as much time as you can spend in that sweet spot of the Torah that help shape you as a person, and the Torah that's going to speak to your students, and then there's translating that needs to happen. Because if you just share the Torah that spoke to you, hopefully your teachers, your Rebbeim took the time to express it in a way that they knew would have the best chance of making it into your heart. And if you just repeat that to your students, it's going to miss. You have to find the words to give them the same experience you had, even if it's not the same Torah that you had. And that's the challenge. But if you can do that, then it's the best job in the world.
But Moshe, part of what I love from what you've shared, both the Torah itself and the experience that you've conveyed, is it's not like your students have some like static set of Torah resonances that you'll either hit or you won't. What will resonate for them, what will be meaningful to them, what they'll be able to hear and what they'll grow from is something that both they and you have some responsibility for, and that can change over time, both as a function of, like, as you said, the deepening of your relationship, getting from the first to the third to the fifth date, but also and the second piece of Torah you said is the progressive work of discerning the Dvar Hashem within our own souls. There's a lot going on in all of our minds and hearts, and some of it is important, some of it's not. And our growth is in finding those strands that are genuinely divine and building them into, weaving them into something better, is to keep the metaphor, something more prominent, and giving them space to grow and breathe. And in the first piece of Torah you said, it was resonated very powerfully with my experience here at Yale, and I think for any of us being on campus, where the last few years, I think objectively, as you said, these have been crazy times, just with massive upheavals in the global order and in the Jewish universe, especially in the last couple of years. And there's a feeling of exigency and urgency. You talked about their students, like we've got to do something. We got to do something big that matches the gravity of what's going on around us. And ideally, like we've got to solve the problems. We got to fix it. If the world is aflame, we got to put the fire out, or create our own fire that's at least as big as the one opposite us, which is probably not going to help. And what you're saying is, actually, we need a kind of like shift in perspective. What's actually most essential, what's actually most important, what's actually most vital might be something that's not there on the surface, that's not going to translate well into an Instagram post or TikTok video, you said. And that's not going to put it in crude terms that we all have to deal with. It may not translate into a great fundraising campaign, because it's going to be something that is internal and deep and relational, and not something that you can easily put into ad copy. And so your work, our work, is helping ourselves and our students and our communities get to places like spiritually, therapeutically, like transform ourselves and grow, so that we can, in fact, engage the Dvar Hashem at the deepest levels. So this time I was rambling way too long and lost my train of thought. But that was, I think, the mark of I think the messiness is precisely the mark of good and rich and like genuinely fruitful Torah. So thank you.
I would like to pile on for a minute and say also that one thing that you mentioned in the beginning was that this is the stuff of history books, and the history books write about certain people, but the overwhelmingly vast majority of people history books don't write about, and the world couldn't have gone on without them. It's just they're less interesting at a certain level, but they're by no means less important, possibly more important. And it seems like the Torah that helps these kinds of people is human Torah. It's just whatever it is that relates, that can connect with them on a human level. And I think as long as that's there, genuine and it's honest, then that's all people really need.
Firstly, thank you for the insightful comments, both of you. It's interesting because listening to you pick this apart a little bit, it's almost like there are two goals in this type of Torah. One is to help them find the shifting Torah, the Torah that's resonant in that moment, the Torah that speaks to what they need to hear right then. And then maybe even deeper than that is just the importance of getting our students used to the idea that this is a primary function of Torah, that when you're feeling uncertain or when you're feeling a moment of difficulty or when you're feeling triumphant and like you've succeeded, there's going to be something in the Torah that's going to be on the exact same frequency and going to give you guidance and going to deepen that experience and going to give you insight into what your next moves are or just how to be with that experience. And even if you get it wrong every time in terms of the practical advice, not that we want that, but if our students can walk out with a heightened sensitivity to the fact that this is what Torah does, like Torah should be that goosebumps moment of like, oh, that's exactly what I'm feeling right now, then maybe that's a big chunk of the mission as well. I know I've said a lot, but I want to maybe just add in one more. Yeah, please.
Can you just give me 1 second? And I'm sorry because I feel like what I said before wasn't fully there, but I think it's definitely going along with what you were saying. But I think it's just like the TikTok stuff isn't always there for us to do, and it's because it shouldn't be there. I'm sure Rav Alex likes to talk about the banality of evil and how some of the most pernicious stuff is not headline grabbing. And I think good operates in the same way. That some of the best good can be equally banal, if you're allowed to say such a thing.
I don't remember which of the rabbis, Neuberger from Ner Yisrael, I heard this from at a conference 10 years ago. But he said, small people occasionally do great things, and great people consistently do small things. And there was something interesting about that. I think one more thing that I just wanted to mention, I am new to the modern Orthodox world. I don't even know if that's the right expression. I essentially grew up Haimish, Haredi, Yeshivish, a little Hasidic, some sort of mixture of all of those things. But in terms of working primarily with modern Orthodox students, this is a new experience. As much as I'm trying to investigate and learn the beautiful Torah that exists in the modern Orthodox world that I had not yet encountered, I'm trying to find those tidbits of Torah, those pieces of Torah from the world that I grew up in that might resonate most, that would be unfamiliar to my students. A tremendous resource has been the Torah of Rav Nebenzahl Shlita, who is totally immersed in the Dati Leumi world in his work with Hesder students and his work at Yeshivat HaKotel, but was a primary Talmud of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. There's an entire sefer of correspondence when they were both in their 30s between Rav Nebenzahl and Rav Chaim Kanievsky called Shuva Me'ava, which is mostly like incredibly high-level Torah discussion and then small little tidbits of personal conversation between the two of them. But seeing Rav Nebenzahl's Torah take Torah from the yeshiva world or the Haredi world and translate it for an audience has been super helpful. And so I've been on the hunt for the Torah that crosses boundaries or that bridges gaps. And in the post-October 7th moment, with that in mind, and also recognizing that our response on campus was going to be different than those of the directors that are in the Miluim or people living in Eretz Yisrael. So I was trying to find some Torah to help process that. Like, what are we supposed to do? What's our response look like in that moment? I came across in the essays of Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. So there's Rosh Yeshiva Mashkiach at Mir. So in his Sichos Musar, there's 3 years essentially of Torah that he taught, and in the newer versions, they printed 6 or 7 shmuzin that he gave during the Yom Kippur War. And it was fascinating to see his response to the Yom Kippur War, and I found it incredibly helpful to give some guidance or advice for what we're going through right now. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz has this idea that he brings up in a handful of places that you can't just daven for somebody intellectually. Like, I know that this person is not well and they're in my life, so I stick in a little Misha Berach for them, or I add them into my Rifa'enu. And that's as much thought or as much of my heart as goes into it. Hashem is aware of other people's struggles and doesn't need you to remind him. There has to be something deeper at play to be able to daven for another person. And he talks about how you really have to feel their experience in your own heart. There has to be some level of pre-existing connection between the two of you, that you're a part of what they're going through and that your tefillos can be a part of getting them out of that situation. And so interestingly, he takes the original source for the idea that the Jewish people's approach to battle, to security, should be split between those that are on the front lines fighting and those that are davening or studying Torah to help keep the merit of the Jewish people where it should be. So the source of that, I believe, is the war with Midian, where we are commanded that we should take elef lamata, 1,000 from every shevet to go to battle with Midian. And the Medrash says that elef lamata is doubled because for every 1,000 in battle, there were 1,000 that were being mispalel for them to be successful. But Reb Chaim Shmulevitz doesn't just take that at its surface understanding. Gam halo ha'elef hasheni mikol shevet u'shevet. Is it not true that the second group of 1,000 people from every shevet, sherak hispalel avor anshe ha'milchama, that their job was only prayer, they weren't in battle. Hayu gam heim tzrichim lalachas l'milchama, but they also had to leave their homes and go travel to the front lines. Va'atam, and the reason, she'iyafshar le'shtatef miracho kol kach, you cannot be a partner in the experience if you're that distant. Vein tfilasam shlema, and their prayer would not be whole. Elak shem bekava mochama, only when they're on the front lines. And so it's such an interesting idea coming from a source where the Mir Yeshiva at the time was primarily engaged in tefillah and Torah on behalf of the Jewish people. But to recognize that when we're a part of it, we have to actually feel like we're a part of it. And it left me with a question that I haven't fully answered, which is, what does going to the front lines look like on a college campus? Like, what is the action that you need to do, or the shift that needs to happen to take it from just like, it's an Eish Tzara, it is unprecedented times, and we need to do something. So we say 2 chapters of Tehillim a day because that won't interfere with getting to class on time. How do you do that from a position of actually feeling like you're a part of what's going on? And I'll be honest, I haven't gotten to the bottom of that just yet.
And that'll be the topic of our next episode.
Really? Amazing. Oh, no. Okay. Also, I'm just going to point out that who knew, like a little intrusive thought over here, who knew that maybe the most destructive elements when we talk about external influences in American culture and the decadence of the West and modern technology infiltrating the Jewish world, who knew that it's the montage that's the root of all evil? This idea that in 3 minutes, all you have are like the highlights, and you take all the effort out and only put in the feelings of success or achievement. It probably has something to do with the feeling we get from doom scrolling and being on our phones, that there's like this constant sense of achievement or dopamine or whatever else it might be, and being uncomfortable with, like, sometimes there's periods of hard work that take time and the gratification only happens later. Anyways, I've gone off the rails a little bit, but down with the montage.
I think this has been amazing, Moshe. Thank you so much, both for what you're doing on campus, all of the Torah you're not just teaching, but I think developing, articulating, and for sharing a bit of it with us.
My absolute pleasure. Continued Hatzlacha with this tremendous series highlighting the amazing JLIC directors and educators and maybe some of the behind-the-scenes people in the future. And I will do my best to feel only inspired and not depressed or inadequate. Okay.
Thanks for coming on.
Todah, Reb Dan. Always a pleasure to see your smiling face, even though now, thanks to you, I have to not only read, but eventually present on the screw tape letters. They did not teach that in Muncie when I was growing up.
Oh, honestly, I was like thinking this whole time about, like, I actually have pulled up on my screen some screw tape letters that would apply to what you're talking about.
All right, I'm going to let you two sort that out.
My goodness.
All right.
Everybody.